The cry came thin and furious from the church steps just as dawn broke gray over Chapel Rock, and Nora Whitfield was the first to reach it, dropping the basket of mending she carried to kneel before the bundled shape wedged into the shadow of the door. A baby, a girl by the look of the faded pink wrapping, no more than a few weeks old, her small face screwed up and reddening with the effort of her cries, a scrap of paper pinned to the blanket that Nora's shaking hands could not yet bring themselves to read. "She's near froze," Nora breathed, gathering the child against her before she had fully decided to, the way a woman's arms sometimes knew a thing before her mind caught up to it. Lord in heaven, who would leave a baby out in the cold like this? Boots sounded on the frosted boardwalk behind her, fast and heavy, and Nora looked up to find Cyrus Bloom striding toward the church with his hat still in his hand, as though he had run the whole distance from his wagon the instant he'd heard the cry. "I heard her from the street," he said, dropping to one knee beside them both, his eyes fixed on the baby with an intensity that startled Nora, a rawness in his face that had nothing polite or distant in it. "Is she hurt? Let me." He reached for the child, and Nora, without quite meaning to, drew back half a step, the baby held tighter against her chest. It was an instinct she did not examine in the moment, only felt, sharp and immediate, the way a woman felt the pull of a fire she had waited years to be allowed to warm herself beside. Cyrus caught the movement, and something flickered across his face, not offense, but a kind of naked, aching understanding, as though he recognized in her arms exactly the same hunger he carried in his own empty ones. "She's cold, but she's breathing strong," Nora said, softening. "I didn't mean to forgive me, Mr. Bloom, I only—" "I know," he said quietly, "I know what you only—" They stood together in the thin morning light, the baby's cries subsiding now that she was held and warmed, and neither of them moved to hand her to the other, and neither of them, for a long moment, said anything at all. It was Reverend Cray who found them there 20 minutes later, drawn out by the commotion, and who took the pinned note from Nora's fingers and read it aloud in the flat, careful voice of a man delivering bad news he had not written himself. The child's mother had died of fever 3 days past, out at a lonely claim past Widow Creek with no kin the note-writer knew of, and the father, it said, had been thrown from a horse and killed a month before that, and there was no one left in this world to claim her, and whoever found her, the note begged, please be kind. Nora felt her arms tighten around the small weight instinctively at the words, and beside her, she heard Cyrus Bloom draw a breath that shook. "I'll take her," they both said, nearly in the same instant, and then looked at each other in a silence that was not quite awkward and not quite anything else Nora had a name for. Cyrus Bloom had buried a wife 2 winters back, and with her the daughter she'd been carrying, both lost in the same long, terrible night, and since then his ranch had run efficient and profitable and utterly silent, a house he came home to only to sleep in, empty of every sound a home ought to hold. He remembered still, with a clarity that never dulled no matter how many seasons passed, the particular quality of that silence the first morning after. No small cry from the cradle he had built with his own hands and never once used. No wife's voice calling him in from the yard for breakfast. Only the wind working at the eaves and his own boots too loud on the floorboards. He had sold the cradle to a family passing through the following spring, unable to look at it standing empty in the corner any longer, and had told himself that was the end of that particular hope, filed away with the rest of what a hard life took from a man and did not give back. He had not gone looking for a child that morning. He had only heard a cry through the cold air and felt something in his chest crack open that he had kept carefully mortared shut for 2 years, and by the time his feet carried him to the church steps he had already, without quite deciding to, begun to think of the baby as something he could not simply walk away from. He looked now at Nora Whitfield, a woman he knew by reputation as the young widow whose husband had died of consumption 3 years past, whose own hopes of children, folks said, in the careful whispers small towns kept for such things, had died with a difficult first confinement that left her unable to carry another. And he understood, watching her hold the foundling as though the child might vanish if she loosened her grip even slightly, that they had each arrived at these steps carrying the exact same wound. And neither one of them was going to yield this small, unclaimed life to the other without a fight. Neither wanted to have. "Reverend," Cyrus said, "what's to be done properly? Who decides where she goes?" "By rights," Reverend Cray said slowly, "the town council ought to take it up, find a family fit to raise her, unless someone comes forward willing and able before that's needed." He looked between them both, and something in his weathered face softened. "Seems to me two such someones are standing right here." Nora felt her face heat. "Reverend, I'm one woman alone, keeping house on what little my sewing brings in. I've no husband, no ranch, no—" "You've got arms that already won't let her go," the Reverend said gently, "and that counts for a good deal more than you're giving it credit for." Cyrus Bloom said nothing to that, but Nora saw him watching her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between assessment and recognition, as though he were turning over a proposition in his mind that he had not yet worked up the courage to voice. The town council met 3 days later in the schoolhouse, and by then both Nora and Cyrus had each, separately, brought the baby into their homes by turns to be fed and tended, passing her back and forth in a fragile, careful truce neither of them had put into words, and both of them had discovered in those 3 days exactly how completely a few pounds of squalling, milk-scented humanity could take up residence in a heart that had thought itself sealed shut for good. On the second night, when it was Nora's turn to keep the child, she had walked the floor of her small rented room for hours with the baby fretful against her shoulder, singing every hymn and lullaby she could summon until her voice went hoarse, and somewhere past midnight, exhausted and aching and happier than she had been in 3 long years, she had caught her own reflection in the dark window glass and hardly recognized the woman looking back, not the careful, contained widow the town had grown used to seeing at market, mending folded neat over one arm and her eyes carefully lowered, but a woman with color high in her cheeks and something fierce and alive behind her eyes, rocking a child she had no legal claim to, as though her whole life had been leading toward that exact unglamorous, sleepless hour. Cyrus, for his part, had spent his own turn with the baby learning, clumsily and by trial, the whole forgotten grammar of infant care, how to test the warmth of milk against his wrist, how to support a head still too weak to hold itself, how to recognize the particular cry that meant hunger from the one that meant only loneliness and wanting to be held. He had sat up with her through a long, colicky night, walking her past the cold hearth in slow circles, and had found himself talking to her in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular: the cattle, the weather, the wife and child he had lost the way a man might talk to fill a silence he had grown unbearably tired of keeping. Nora sat in the schoolhouse's front row with the baby asleep against her shoulder and listened to the council debate the matter in the dry, procedural tones men used for things that were, to her, the whole of her heart laid bare on a table. One councilman suggested the widow Aldridge, whose own children were grown and gone. Another suggested writing to the county orphanage in Cheyenne. Nora felt each suggestion land like a small blow, and held the baby tighter and said nothing, because what right did she have, a woman with no husband and no means, to argue against homes with 2 parents and steady income both? It was Cyrus who stood. "I'd like to be considered," he said, plain and unhurried the way he said most things. "I've got a working ranch, a sound house, means enough to raise a child right, and God knows more room in that house than any one man rightly needs to fill alone." He paused, and Nora, watching him, saw something cross his face that looked almost like fear, though she could not have said of what. "But I don't reckon a ranch and a bank account make a home by themselves. A child needs more than a roof and beef on the table. She needs—" He stopped, started again. "Mrs. Whitfield's had that baby quieted inside a minute, 3 separate times now, when I couldn't manage it in 20. I don't know what that is exactly, except that it's the thing a mother has and a rancher alone doesn't, and I'd be a fool and worse to stand here and pretend I could give this child everything she needs by myself, when there's a woman not 10 feet from me who plainly already can." The room had gone very quiet. Nora felt her pulse hammering in her throat. "What are you proposing, Bloom?" the council chairman asked. Cyrus turned and looked at Nora directly for the first time since he'd begun speaking, and whatever nerve he'd been gathering, he spent it all at once. "I'm proposing marriage," he said, "to Mrs. Whitfield if she'll have me, so that this child needn't be sorted between two half-homes when she might instead have one whole one. I know it's sudden. I know it's not how these things are ordinarily done. But I've watched this woman hold that baby for 3 days now like she was made for exactly that purpose, and I've felt, watching her, the first thing like peace I've had in 2 years, and I'd be lying to this whole council and to myself besides if I said that wasn't reason enough." Every eye in the schoolhouse turned to Nora, and she sat very still, the baby's small weight warm and real against her shoulder, and thought of 3 years spent grieving a husband and a body that had failed her in the one thing the whole world seemed to expect of a wife. 3 years of watching other women's children from a careful, aching distance, because it hurt less to look away than to hope. And she thought that she had never once imagined this particular door might open for her, in a schoolhouse. In front of half the town, offered by a grieving rancher with steady eyes and an honest, unpolished proposal. "Yes," she said before she had entirely finished thinking it through, because some decisions she was learning did not need thinking through so much as answering true. "Yes, Mr. Bloom, I'll have you." The council, visibly relieved to have the matter resolved without further deliberation, voted the arrangement sound within the hour, provided the marriage was properly solemnized, which Reverend Cray offered to see done that very evening. And by the time the sun set red and gold over Chapel Rock, Nora Whitfield stood at the little altar with a foundling asleep in the arms of the Reverend's own wife and a rancher's rough, sincere hand closing around hers, and spoke vows she had never once expected to speak again in this life. It was not, in the weeks that followed, an easy peace to build. Cyrus was a man long accustomed to silence, and Nora was a woman long accustomed to holding her grief close and private, and there were evenings in that first month when the two of them sat at supper with the baby between them in her basket and found more comfortable things to say to the child than to each other. Nora worried, in the small hours when sleep would not come, that she had married a kind stranger out of necessity and convenience both, and wondered whether affection built on so practical a foundation could ever grow into anything sturdier than polite cohabitation. She kept these worries to herself, the way she kept most things, folding them away neatly like linen that might be needed again later, and busied herself instead with the 1,000 small tasks of a new household and a new child, and told herself that was enough for now, and perhaps would have to be enough forever. But there was also, Nora found, a particular tenderness in watching a hard, grief-shuttered man learn, hour by hour, to be gentle, the careful, clumsy way Cyrus first held the baby, terrified of his own strength, and the wondering softness that came into his face as she quieted against his shoulder. The evening she found him standing at the crib long after the child had fallen asleep, simply watching her breathe, as though reassuring himself the small miracle of her was still there. "I used to think," he told Nora one such evening, not looking up from the crib, "that I didn't have any more tenderness left in me, buried it with my wife and the child we lost together, and thought that was the whole of what a man got one chance and mine had come and gone." He looked at her then and his voice roughened. "I didn't know a heart could grow back new tenderness for a life it never expected to hold. I didn't know that until you too, if I'm honest, watching you with her." Nora crossed the room and stood beside him at the crib, close enough that her shoulder rested against his arm, and found she did not want to move away. "I spent 3 years believing I'd been given no more chances either," she said softly. "Believing whatever was broken in me that couldn't carry a child of my own meant I'd forfeited the whole of that particular joy for good. I don't think either of us had this in mind, Cyrus. A church step, a stranger's grief, a baby with no one. But I don't think that makes it any less ours, now that we've got her." "No," he agreed, and reached for her hand where it rested on the crib's edge, and held it there in the lamplight, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles over her knuckles as though he could not quite make himself let go now that he'd finally taken hold. "I think, Nora, that I've been half a man these 2 years, going through the motions of a life without ever once feeling I was living it. I didn't know how much until this house started filling up with the two of you. Then we're neither one of us half of anything any longer," she said, and found she meant it more fully than she had meant almost any words in years. "I don't think it does." They named her Grace, for the manner in which she had come to them, and in the years that followed Chapel Rock told the story often, softened by retelling into something almost like legend. Of the morning, a barren widow and a grieving rancher had both reached for an abandoned child at the very same instant, and found, in refusing to let go of either the baby or in time of each other, the whole family that each of them had privately given up all hope of ever holding. Nora never forgot the particular terror of that first reach, the fear that she had no right to claim what her arms already knew was hers, and she never forgot, either, the moment Cyrus Bloom had stood before the whole town council and admitted, plainly and without shame, that a home needed more than beef and lumber to be whole. It needed two people willing to be broken open again by love, after each had believed themselves sealed shut for good. And on quiet evenings, long after Grace had grown past her cradle and into a sturdy, laughing girl who filled the ranch house with exactly the noise it had been missing, Nora would sometimes catch Cyrus watching the two of them, mother and daughter, with the same look he'd worn on the church steps that first cold morning, as though he still could not quite believe his own good fortune in finding, where he had least expected it, everything he had thought was lost to him for good.